In 1991, 22 CNA field reps deployed to the Middle East to support Operation Desert Storm. These are their stories. Persian Gulf, February 2nd, 1991. General Norman Schwarzkopf, leader of the coalition forces, steps out of his helicopter onto the deck of USS Blue Ridge. 5 minutes later, a second helicopter arrives, carrying Lieutenant General Walter Boomer, commander of the Marine Forces ashore. The two generals flew to Vice Admiral Stanley Arthur's flagship to make the most important decision of the war for the naval forces afloat. For months, Admiral Arthur's amphibious task force had been planning for an invasion of Kuwait from the sea. The potential target? A logistics port that could resupply General Boomer's forces during the land invasion. Seeing the movements of the U.S. Navy, Iraq had divided its forces to protect Ashuaiba. General Schwarzkopf, General Boomer, and Admiral Arthur know that taking Ashuaiba would be deadly and destructive. The Iraqi army is dug in and prepared for a U.S. landing. So the commanders decide to run a deception operation. So why don't you just start off by introducing yourself for us?
I'm Marvin Pokrant. I worked for CNA for 13 years, and much of that in the field and on sea duty. In particular, I was the representative at 7th Fleet when Admiral Moss was designated as the commander of all the naval forces in the Central Command. And I went with the advance party to Bahrain and was with the command for all of Desert Shield and Desert Storm.
And we're going to talk about that shortly, but I do understand you have a new book coming out.
Yes, it's the New Principles of War, Enduring Truths with Timeless Examples. It covers a lot of the lessons I've learned over many years, and it's coming out in April from Atomic Books.
And I've actually been reading your book, Desert Storm at Sea, to prepare for this series. So I definitely would encourage anyone listening to keep an eye on that when it comes out. But let's get into our discussion for today. So as you mentioned, you were the CNA's field rep for Naval Forces Central Command during Desert Storm. And that's, of course, why we wanted to have you on today. You know, in this episode, we're talking about the amphibious invasion that never was. But just to get started, I'd like to hear a little bit about your impressions of some of the commanders that we're talking to on this episode, starting out with Admiral Arthur.
Well, he was a great guy to work for. He'd had a lot of positive experiences with CNA in the past. And various people he had consulted along the way said kind words about myself. So he was all primed to give me a chance to prove myself. One of the things he said to me on several occasions was that he really valued having somebody on the staff who he did not control. In other words, I could tell him whatever I wanted, even if it wasn't the staff line, so to speak.
And this is actually something that's come up a couple of times throughout this series, is the value of having third-party analysts who aren't beholden to the chain of command involved in these kind of efforts.
Yeah.
And in a similar vein, what about Major General Jenkins, who we're also speaking to on this episode?
I did not know him personally during the operation, but one of the things I recall him saying was that one of his jobs was to try and get as many of his Marines home alive as possible.
Limiting casualties, which was a priority of the command throughout this entire operation. It seemed like General Schwarzkopf and General Boomer shared that assessment as well.
Yes, I thought throughout the entire chain of command, there was a strong emphasis on minimizing casualties. And if you think of the caricature of, say, World War I, where generals sent people off to die with hardly a second thought, that was definitely not the case here. And the thought occurred to me several times that, say, parents who sent their sons or daughters off to fight in this war could have a lot of confidence that while people were going to get hurt and some would get killed, that the command was not going to throw away their lives foolishly.
So why don't you start off by introducing yourself and telling me your role in Desert Storm?
Okay, I'm retired Admiral Stanley Arthur, and during Desert Storm, I was the Navy component commander, reporting to General Schwarzkopf for the operations.
Well, it's a real honor to have you on today, Sarah. Thank you so much for joining us. It's
a pleasure to be here, 30 years later.
Exactly, yeah, 30-year anniversary. Well, we're here today for this. The theme of this episode is about the amphibious landing, and some have called it the landing that never was. And I think, as we talk about this now, it's kind of easy to look back on it and say, oh, it was always intended as a deception. But that wasn't necessarily the case at the time, correct?
No, it's really a very complicated issue. Thinking of, was there going to be an amphibious landing? Well, what kind of amphibious landing? When amphibious landing? Where amphibious landing? It became obvious to me, just checking in on the scene. Hank Moss had been there for the Desert Shield, the buildup. I got there in December, and obviously the timeline had already been established by President Bush. So the thought of, is an amphibious landing a part of the kickoff of the campaign? With my check-in with General Schwarzkopf, it became pretty obvious to me that he was not really in favor of an amphibious landing, but he was very much in favor of, we've got to make it absolutely clear that we are prepared to do an amphibious landing. And we want him to believe, Saddam, we want him to believe that we are going to have an amphibious landing if we're going to come after him. So he says, your job is to sell this. So the job of selling that was, of course, doing lots of practices and moving people around, doing various things that showed our intent to do an amphibious assault.
When it came to amphibious warfare, Admiral Arthur knew that there was no force more capable than the U.S. Marine Corps. He tasks Major General Jenkins with making the plan for the landing.
I am Harry W. Jenkins, Jr. I was a Marine Corps Major General at the time the Desert Storm broke out. I was the commanding general of the 4th Marine Expeditionary Brigade, which is located in Little Creek, Virginia at the time.
Well, it's a real honor to have you on today, sir. Thanks so much for joining me. So, Major General, if you could just take me through what the plan was for the amphibious landing, if you had to do it.
All right. The mission that was handed down from U.S. Navy, the Navy Central Command, which in effect was Admiral Arthur, was one of 3 missions. The first one was to do the amphibious landing at Ashwaiba. Ashwaiba was that petrochemical complex on the coast of Kuwait. Okay.
Right. And this is not too far from the Saudi border, correct?
That's correct. So that was the initial plan. And when I started, and I had no idea that anything else was going on. So we started to do the analysis, and the first thing that got my attention was I was not going to land in the middle of one of the biggest petrochemical complexes in the Middle East. There were also 2 liquid gas, the LNG plants or tanks in there that had any one of them gone off, it would look like a small nuke. And at one point, I think NavCent suggested that they take them out. I know that wasn't approved. Okay. That was the one part of it. The second part was that when we did an analysis of the environment, i.e. the gradients and the surf zones and all that, there was only one place where we could actually land our LCUs, a landing craft that had the tanks in it,
Mm-hmm.
where the water was deep enough so that the ships could get in close enough to the beach to let the tanks get off. Okay. That was up at a place called Alfintas, which is on that map I think I sent to you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So if we'd had to, that's what the plan would be. We would land, do the landing there. Would have at that time I had 2 regiments. The 2nd Marines would wheel south towards Ashwaiba. The other one would go. 5th Marines would go north and block anything coming out of Kuwait City. All right.
Mm-hmm.
There was an option to provide some sort of a logistics build up on the beaches. In case one MAF needed it, turned out they didn't, so that went away.
With the land invasion approaching, Admiral Arthur still has not received Schwarzkopf's decision on the role of amphibious forces. Finally, the general agrees to meet aboard Blue Ridge. Under one condition.
I had to assure General Schwarzkopf that the seas were calm. There was not going to be any rocking and rolling, and because he was deathly afraid of being seasick.
And so we return to the February 2nd meeting aboard Blue Ridge. Lieutenant General Boomer steps forward to give his presentation.
Walt Boomer gave his presentation, and it was pretty dire on what he thought his losses would be and the force that he thought he would be against. And although he didn't absolutely say that I need an amphibious landing to help me out, he made it fairly clear that if he got stalled out or ran out of the logistics somewhere along the line, he was going to need reinforcements. And so that sort of said, after the thing starts, there may be a necessity to do a landing. Schwarzkopf came away from that saying, you've got to sell this thing a little bit harder than we've been doing. I'm going to authorize you to do some raids type things to show that we really are in the final preparations for doing a landing. By that time, I said, okay, it's time to get the minesweepers moving north, get the battleships moving north, get a couple of the amphibs up there. We started with, raid type things on Falaka and some other alternative targets that we could do easily without involving the full force.
The raid on Falaka was designed to, as it turned out later on, to reinforce the idea that the Marines were coming. Okay. Now, to go into Falaka, take the island, use it as a base to stage for further movement inland or across the water into Kuwait itself. That's a legitimate mission. That's what it was initially designed to be. As you know that we were going to do a heavy raid in there to go in and land both surface and helicopter means and only go so far and stop to create that they're coming kind of thing, because there was an Iraqi Marine brigade of sorts on the island. Okay. After that, General Schwarzkopf said he thought we would do that. He should do it because Admiral Arthur and I went and briefed him on all this. And but he told me he was having trouble with it in Washington. Okay. But when the mine strikes occurred, that turned everything around.
2 mine strikes on those on your ships?
Well, one of them was mine, the Tripoli. That was the LPH that had the mine hunting helicopters on it. That's the one that took it was a $1,500 moored contact mine, I think. Blew a 10 by 20 foot hole in the hull of the ship. Fortunately, nobody got killed. 4 hours later, the Princeton, a $1 billion cruiser, activated 2 bottom influence mines, which creates a huge bubble that comes up and hits the bottom of the ship. It did severe damage to the ship in that it jammed the rudders, and I believe it knocked the radars off and everything else. And when that happened, people really started to get nervous about this, because that's when they discovered we got more up here than we thought we had. So Tripoli was pulled off and sent back to be repaired in Dubai. Okay. And then they took another LPA, another helicopter carrier, out of Amphibious Group 3, which is part of our force, and put the mine hunting helicopters on another LPH helicopter carrier. And we moved the Marines elsewhere. I don't remember how long Princeton stayed in there, probably not too long as I recall. But I was concerned about the amphibs because we were feeding these helicopter carriers to support the mine hunting, which at that time had begun.
The mine strikes on Tripoli and Princeton shocked the staff at Navy Central Command.
And in the NavCent Command Center, the initial reaction was, that can't be. It's impossible because ships have been steaming around in that area for 48 hours. Well, they went and verified the report and overcame their disbelief, but I think it is indicative when people are hit with astounding news like that, their first reaction is to say, no, that can't be. And it takes them a little time to come to terms with it. Similarly, just a couple hours later, the cruiser Princeton went over an influence mine on the bottom, and that caused a fair amount of damage. And when that report came in, the reaction was, that can't be true. They must mean Tripoli, not Princeton. They just got the name of their ship wrong.
And these mines caused like a lot of trouble for movement throughout the Persian Gulf, closer to Kuwait, and more so than perhaps was predicted. Why do you think this was such a problem for the Navy and what was otherwise a pretty smooth operation?
Well, first, the U.S. Navy has never put huge amounts of resources into minesweeping. Part of that was because with NATO, the idea was that our allies would take care of minesweeping, and we would take care of providing things like aircraft carriers. Detractors of the Navy say that, well, the Navy didn't put the money in because minesweeping isn't very sexy. The reason it's so successful is that, unlike, say, an Iraqi conscript, mines do not surrender. They don't get scared and run away. They aren't affected by shock and awe. They just sit there and do their job, provided they've been deployed correctly. And that was one of the things the Iraqis did that was really poor, in that they just misdeployed many of the mines so that they wouldn't go off even if you hit them.
Mm-hmm. So we understand that these mines are a threat. We understand that this really was slowing down Navy operations and that minesweeping in the traditional sense is a very time-consuming process. But I understand that some of your work was looking for innovative ways to speed up mine clearing operations.
Well, early on in Desert Storm, the Chief of Staff formed a working group called the Naval Operations Working Group, in which there were, I believe, 8 or 9 of us on it. And of the 8 officers, 4 of them eventually made flag rank, so it was a pretty high-powered group. And our task was to put together all the things across all different departments on the staff and figure out what was really needed to make this work. Now, most of us, I believe, didn't really think an amphibious assault was a good idea. Nevertheless, our task was to figure out how to make it happen if we were ordered to do so. So one of the things that was proposed that didn't last very long was the Iraqis had many tankers anchored off the coast that they had dumped the oil out of. So we could capture one of those and use it as a mine layer on the philosophy that every ship is a mine layer once. But as soon as we thought about that, it just wasn't such a good idea. Yeah, the SEALs could capture a tanker, but they wouldn't know how to start it. And in any case, it would take several hours to get steam up. And after that, well, the sweep width is only about 1 ship wide, so it's not really going to do us much good. Another thought we had was to have SEALs using an underwater vehicle go up and surveil some likely spots to see if they could see whether there were any mines there or not. And they did that in 6 or 7 places and didn't see anything. But the problem with that is it's such a small area that they could search. And it turns out they'd been sent to search where there probably weren't any mines for the most part. The best idea we had was to capture an Iraqi mine layer or other ship and see if they had any charts on board that might show where the minefields were. And that was indeed done. We captured a mine layer, and it had charts showing big X's with minefield on it. The problem was it only covered one minefield right near the border of Kuwait that we sort of knew about anyway, and didn't cover the minefields that were of more interest to us. So that was almost a little bit of false hope there.
One of these projects was part of Navy Central Command's presentation to General Schwarzkopf during the February 2nd meeting aboard Blue Ridge.
As part of the Naval Operations Working Group, I ran several models in close consultation with the other people. One of the best modeling experiences of my career, because it was the interchange between me and them deciding what were you really trying to accomplish, what assets did you have available, what questions did you want answered. It wasn't just I go off in the corner, run a model, and give them a number. The discussion of how to develop the model, what inputs to use, drove a large part of the discussion and made them think about what I consider to be important factors. So we came up with a number of estimates, most particularly about how long it would take for mine clearance operations and how many ships you might suffer hits with, depending on how thoroughly you did the minesweeping. So on February 2nd, we gave him a briefing, and most of the numbers in that briefing were based on models that I had run.
February 24th, 1991. General Boomer's forces cross the border into Kuwait and head towards Kuwait City. Iraqi positions are poorly defended, and many of their forces surrender. 3 days later, Saddam Hussein orders his forces to retreat from Kuwait, and President Bush declares the country liberated. Do you believe this deception was a successful operation overall? Because there is a lot of conversation about how, while there was an impression that the Iraqis were going to be like a force to be reckoned with, this battle-hardened force from the Iran-Iraq war that was prepared for, the coalition forces, ultimately, a lot of them retreated, a lot of them fled, and the ground forces pretty easily were able to accomplish their mission. Do you still consider the amphibious diversion to be a success given these factors?
I think so, in the fact that we did keep a significant amount of his forces looking our way. So even though when the pressure came, that was still a number of folks that were looking at us instead of maybe holding the other guys' backs up a little bit stiffer and saying you gotta do your part over there. So my belief is that we were able to keep him looking two ways, and so we divided his effort. That helped it fold so rapidly, is that they were overwhelmed from the sweep, and by that time the guys that had been looking at us, they had no fight left, as Walt found out when he started up. He started moving so fast, he could hardly keep up with the speed that they were moving.
Like any good CNA analyst should, Marvin Pokrant challenges the Navy's assumptions about the success of the deception operation. In your view, was this deception a successful operation?
That's a very good question. Certainly, I would say the Navy's position is it was extremely successful because I've heard various numbers, but let's say a dozen Iraqi divisions remained on the coast defending against an amphibious assault. And there was the infamous sand table that was the Iraqis in Kuwait had put together that showed arrows with the forces coming in from the sea. However, the question is, what's the goal of the deception? And In my forthcoming book, The New Principles of War, I got a long chapter on deception and what its goal should be. And the goal of deception should not be just to make the enemy believe something, but to make them do something specific that you can exploit. And it's hard to point to anything specific they did. Yes, they didn't move any forces away from the coast, but on the other hand, these were immobile divisions anyway. They weren't about to go reorient themselves against the left hook. What it did do is, when those divisions were put in place, by probably November, December, a lot of divisions were put near the coast. So it was that initial threat that was successful. The place where it probably, or at least might have made a big difference, is in keeping the Iraqis focus on the coast so that they didn't spend too much time thinking of what they should have been thinking of, which is there any way those sneaky Americans might bring armor across the desert to the west? And as long as they didn't think of that.
Even though the Marines never had to go forward with the amphibious landing, Desert Storm was a proving ground for a new concept that the service was exploring. So, coming out of Desert Storm, what were the big takeaways for the Marine Corps, and how did it affect the service going forward?
Well, we had been practicing what we would call maneuver warfare, and I won't bore you with that, but the idea is to go where the enemy is not if you can. Okay, and that's a function of maneuver. In one MEF's case, they had to go straight into the guns. In my case, if I had done the Schwab thing, that would have created all kinds of problems, okay, in coordination and all that. There was only one real place to do that if it had ever come to that, and that was the Alpha Peninsula. But it never got to that. It never got to that point in the planning cycle, even though General Buber and I had discussed it. The reason for that is the back door was wide open. There was nothing there. So you could go in there and establish a force, which in effect might have frozen some of the Iraqi units, which are further up around the city of Basra. From a Marine Corps point of view, you want to go somewhere where you can maneuver and not do the infamous amphibious assaults that we were required to do in World War II for all the obvious reasons. Okay.
Right, because they're brutal and
and casualties. And I think in this case, we had been practicing those tactics for at least 10 years prior to Desert Shield, Desert Storm. So the takeaway on that was, one, if you're going to use that, in my opinion, if you're going to use a force this size, put it somewhere where you can create some sort of a strategic move to do something to the other side, okay? Whether you actually engage or feint or whatever.
So while Al-Shuaibah was just over the Saudi border, and while it provided the valuable logistics port, it wouldn't otherwise have changed the equation very much. Whereas by landing in Al-Fa, you were able to establish a base and then move out around behind Saddam's troops. And what this shows in terms of like overall future takeaways is that if you're going to use resources like this, as you said, make sure that you're actually capitalizing on those resources and changing the flow of the battle in a meaningful way, rather than just, maybe securing a minor resource, but one that another unit can also get access to. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, you're trying to pin the other side. You're trying to outmaneuver them. You're trying to outfake them, create opportunities for other forces that are coming from a different direction, all that kind of thing. That's maneuver. And that's the one thing you've attempted to try to do today, even today, is if you're going to use maneuver, go where the weak spots are. Mm-hmm. That requires decent intelligence, of course.
Right.
And then go from there. Any good commander would want to do that versus being forced to do something like we had to do in World War II in today's environment.
Well, Major General, thank you so much for coming on today. It's been a real honor to talk to you, and thank you for your service.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure to be able to help.
Marv, I want to thank you so much for being on the show today. I think we got a lot out of this, and I appreciate your time.
Thank you, John, for all the good questions and lead-in. I appreciate it.
Well, sir, I just want to thank you so much again for joining us. I think it's been a great conversation.
Okay, my pleasure.
Analysis in Combat is edited and produced by John Stimpson, with executive producer Don Burrows. Theme music is by Edward Granga. If you enjoy our show, we'd love if you could give us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts and tell your friends about us. Thanks for listening. We'll see you in 2 weeks.